The Lord be with you. Let us pray. As has become our practice, I invite you to join me in saying this prayer. God, by whom the meek are guided in judgment, and light rises up in darkness for the godly, grant us in all our doubts and uncertainties the grace to ask what you would have us do, that the Spirit of wisdom may save us from all false choices, and that in your light we may see light, and in your straight path we may not stumble. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. So welcome to Easter. As the dean reminded us in his sermon, Easter is not a day, it's a season. So the new life that we spent Lent preparing for, we get to celebrate throughout the entire season. Having done the screw tape letters in Lent, which I really enjoyed, by the way, so thank you for that, there was a lot of what you shouldn't do. And I thought perhaps we should turn to the book of Genesis to discover some of what the Bible says about what you should do, how you might live into the new life of Easter. So I'm going to work out of a book by Leon Kass, who was a professor at the University of Chicago. But you needn't buy the book. I've shown you the front of the book on purpose because it's 1,000 pages. So I didn't want to show you the side of the book for fear that you would never come back. But it is an easy read, and if you kind of enjoy the things that we're talking about, you may want to pick it up. But you don't have to run out and buy it unless you're really willing to make that commitment of time. And I'm going to tell you all the important stuff anyway. All right, The Beginning of Wisdom, Reading Genesis by Leon Kass. Marilyn Robinson has a new book out on Genesis too. Do you guys know Marilyn Robinson, the novelist who wrote, she wrote a trilogy that, Gilead. And she's also written a bunch of wonderful nonfiction. Anyway, she's got a new book out on Genesis as well. So no shortage of resources to study this book. We are, however, going to be asking a question throughout this entire term. And in order to get it all in, I'm going to extend the term past our normal termination date on Memorial Day through the end of June, because it'll take that amount of time not to just cram every session with data and information. And the question is, basically, how then should we live? Kass states it, as you might expect from a learned professor, using more words. Here's what he says. Is it possible to find, institute, and preserve a way of life, responsive to both the promise and peril of the human creature, that accords with man's true standing in the world and that serves to perfect his godlike possibilities? That's Kass's fulsome statement. I'm going to translate that into how then shall we live, kind of pulling from Martin Luther King's last book. What I love about the approach we're going to take to the book of Genesis is we're not going to try to figure out when stuff was written or who wrote it or whether it's knit together in the right order. We're going to talk about the wisdom that it contains, the message, guidance, and instruction that it offers us for how we should live our lives. So why read it? It is, in fact, a coherent narrative. In fact, what I hope you're going to discover during our time together is that most of your favorite Bible stories are actually in Genesis. You don't think of them that way, but they are there. A lot of the dean's sermon this morning with all his descriptions of various brothers are all out of stories in Genesis. The first part, which we'll cover today, frankly, it's just a chapter, kind of prepares us for the arrival of God's new way. Actually, it's not just this chapter. It's everything up to to Abraham, I would claim. It's the inauguration of Abraham, which starts the covenant, which starts God's new way of living. But so there's a part of the book. Today we'll cover kind of the abstract part, then we'll get into more narrative parts that deal with human nature. And then after that, the rest enables a reader to learn what it might offer and require of her. So it's a wonderful treatment of God's new way. What is the new way? As I mentioned, it's inaugurated with the election of Abraham, and I think it has two basic principles. The practice of righteousness in relations towards others, which is informed by the pursuit of holiness relating to the divine. Does this sound familiar? Righteousness in relations with others and holiness in relation to God. Did Jesus say anything like that? Remember the summary of the law? Pretty much the same thing, right? How do we let our relationship with God show us how to be in relationship with each other? How do we let our relationship with God, holiness, show us how to be in relationship with each other, righteousness? Righteousness you might think of as meaning right relationship. Right relationship. Not self-absorbed feelings of superiority, but right relationship. All right. So the first creation story, it's basically the first chapter of Genesis and 3 verses into the second chapter. And it offers an account of the whole world in which creation precedes the questions of human character and what life ought to be like. This is the creation of the world. You know there's a second creation story, right? That's the Garden of Eden, and we'll deal with that next week. But I want to look at this story in the first chapter of Genesis 3 different times. Take 3 different takes on it. It's a story that yields more meaning each time you go over it. So what you see in your first read through will inform and reveal what you see in your second read through, and the same is true for a third read view. So we're going to try to do that quickly this morning. The first take, by the way, these icons are Eastern Orthodox icons. There are 8 of them. Each one depicts a different scene from the creation. They're kind of wonderful. I'm not going to talk about them much, but that's what's there on the side of these slides. The first take, what do we learn the first time we go through this chapter? We learn, I think, that God is the creator. God is the creator. That may not sound like a profound statement, but I'm going to try to persuade you that it's a very intentional statement that has real consequences. If God is the creator, then nothing else is. Both the heavens and the earth are creations. Both the heavens and the earth are creations. Human beings have a special place in the world order. That's not, in many ways, a very popular claim anymore, this priority that we have traditionally granted to human beings. It's not popular because people think it leads us into believing we can not treat creation with proper care. It's not popular because people think it leads us into believing that we don't treat animals as they deserve. It's not popular because people believe it leads us into racism and xenophobia and misogyny and all the other ways that we tend to think one element of our species is superior to everything else. One of the questions I will leave you with this morning, is that true or not? I think it's pretty clear that in the scriptural treatment, human beings are the highest peak of creation, the ultimate element of creation, in fact. So the chapter starts with, in the beginning, God, Elohim, created the heavens and the earth. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, whether that's in the beginning of time or in the beginning of the story, I will leave that to you to determine. But what does it mean to say that God created the heavens and the earth? It means, I think, to say that God is the creator. And if God is the creator, then nothing else is. At the time that Genesis was written, of course, there are a lot of other candidates for creator or God. Each civilization had its own gods, typically polytheistic, multiple gods. Often they were drawn from nature. Sometimes, as in Greek mythology, I've got a 12-year-old at home. I've heard all the Greek mythology I can possibly stand for a lifetime. I bet maybe you have too. I'm sure we've gone from Greek to Roman, and I'm sure Norse is next. So there's a lot about gods in our culture and in other cultures. If you think about what the Babylonians worshipped, or what the Persians worshipped, or what the Egyptians worshipped, they're typically one or more gods that are drawn from nature. That are drawn from nature. The second verse says, "And the earth was unformed and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the waters." And the earth was unformed and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the waters. So I have a question for you. Now you remember our process of questions. We are going to need 2 microphones. So John's got one, and are you going to manage the other? So here's whoever's going to answer this question first. The next person, please raise your hand. We're going to try to get the microphone to you, so when it's time to speak, you'll be ready. But don't speak until you have the microphone. Here's the question. Did creation come from nothing? That's called creation ex nihilo, if you're into your Latin. Did creation come from nothing? Did God just create it out of nothing? Or maybe was it a big bang? Or was it always there? Let's review this statement. "And the earth was unformed and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the waters." So is the position of Genesis that creation came from nothing, or was it already there? This is a big deal for a lot of people. What do you think? I love it. None of this bothers you at all, right?
Let's get the ball rolling. I am confident that it came from nothing. Otherwise, it wasn't created by the good Lord, and I'm sure that it was because he needed a place for us.
So what do you make of the waters there in that quote?
That was my part, which is there's already waters and there's deep, so there's something there.
You see the point, did God just create everything out of nothing, or is he working with stuff that's already there? Yeah.
I actually had it as creating from nothing because of the previous verse, which is,
in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth.
So he created it from the earth from nothing, but he had not finished it. And so the face over the waters was the face over the creation of earth that he had started, but not completed.
Nice. So the first sentence articulates creation from nothing, and the second sentence is, and then he put the clay on the wheel and made it into something. Nice. What else? Any other thoughts about that?
I'm the speaker for the row. We want to know, what does nothing mean? What is the etymology of that? Because if you've got to create something, there must be something there to create from nothing. Just the philosophical term.
Yeah, what is nothing? What is it? That's a great point, because my personal, I mean, nothing, I don't know. What is the absence of anything? Is a vacuum nothing? I can't conceive of nothing. Can you conceive of nothing? I don't think the authors of Genesis could conceive of nothing either. But that is the majority position. That's the dominant Christian doctrine, that God created ex nihilo. Everything that exists comes from the generous, loving hand of God, which is probably more consistent with Big Bang Theory, and it correlates, but I just can't conceive of nothing. So I don't know. Does it make a difference to you? You don't care? It kind of does make a difference to me, because just like Doug said, if something was already there, then it's not all the creation of God.
I don't think you should overthink it.
Yeah. You are 50 years too late, dear. All right. This is a big debate among theologians. I want you to know about it because it will impact how you view the relationship of science and theology. So could Randy get the mic?
I think one thing the authors were doing, all the religions at the time worshiped creation, and they were trying to present the position there was a creator as opposed to creation. So that's their purpose. What the facts were, who knows? But I think that was the purpose of the authors.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think again, it's going to matter when we start talking about science. There.
I think there's another way of looking at this. What if all was there? Everything that we can conceive of was there all the time, and it was the development of consciousness that brought it into our awareness, and that maybe it's our need as human beings to create in our own minds something from nothing, when all of God's creation, everything that is, was always there, and we came into that through consciousness, when consciousness developed.
Yeah, nice. More about the material may have been there, but the awareness of it generates something new. All right. Well, I want this question to lurk in your mind. You can put it in the box of overthinking for the moment. But it's there. All right, let's move on unless I'm missing any burning comments. All right. So I want to introduce you to the cast of characters, beginning with light and ending with human beings. This is over the 6 days of creation. On day 1, light and the separation of light and dark named day and night. Note there's no mention of the sun here. The sun doesn't get created until the 4th day. But light and the demarcation of time is created on the 1st day. Do you see that? Light and the demarcation of time on the 1st day, but no sun. Day 2, the firmament, the vault of the sky, named heavens, back to our first verse, which separates the waters above and the waters below. Day 3, the separation of gathered terrestrial waters from the emerging dry land, respectively named seas and earth, and vegetation, grass, herbs, trees, each after its kind. Another phrase that has caused a lot of trouble over the years, puts forth by the earth. Again, no sun yet. Why? Why do you think there's no sun yet? Randy, why do you think there's no sun yet? The sun was worshipped by other cultures. Maybe, just maybe, there's a diminishment of that God. Day 4, the lights in the heavens, the greater, the lesser, and the stars. Finally, the sun is created. Day 5, the fish of the sea, the birds of the open sky, after their kinds. Day 6, the terrestrial animals after their kinds, and man made in God's image, male and female. So you see how this order progresses, with man being the crowning achievement. Man there being gender neutral. The Greek is anthropos, which I learned in seminary means not a rock. That's how my teacher described anthropos, translated as man in all of our English works. He said it means not a rock. It may have a male technical gender, but it doesn't refer to men. What do you think? The question is, what is the water above and the water below? Give here.
Above would be rain and clouds, and the water below is after it hits the ground. I don't
Okay.
know. Rivers, lakes.
sky named heavens, which separates the waters above. And so the heavens are in between the waters above and the waters below.
It's a wonderment.
So you finally come to wonderment after all. It's okay, good.
I mean, obviously, the kind of point you're raising, at least it's by implication, is that the science here is not modern science. The understanding of the heavens and the universe is not the same then as it is now. So they understood what we now refer to as a three-tiered universe, and we don't think of the world that way anymore. So this language, in my view, is not intended to be scientific. Doesn't mean your question's not a good one. It's just not intended to reference a particular piece of matter or space necessarily. It's supposed to explain why. It's supposed to give meaning to, ultimately, to our existence with God. So I have no idea what they thought they were talking about. It's right on the same level that you have ex nihilo. That's where I have the waters. All right. So there you have it. 6 days, process of creation. The main point seems to be, as Randy articulated, that by implication, all these other gods are diminished. All these gods from nature that have dominated all the rival civilizations are diminished because God is the creator, not them. The sun probably being the most powerful god, and of course, prominent in Egypt. So let's take a second look at the story. And what I want to show you in the second look is the main principles at work in creation are place, separation, motion, and life. But really separation. What this story is telling us is that God is constantly distinguishing one thing from another. That's how creation works. One thing is distinguished from another. There's a dualism, if you will, built into this creation story. The world comes alive when separate things are given their independent identities. That doesn't mean they're not related to each other, the way we have discussed before, but they have a separate identity, a separate form, a separate type, and then they continue to breed and grow in that type. Creation is bringing order out of chaos, largely through acts of separation, division, and distinction. Does that make sense? We talk a lot about how separated we are and how divided everything is and how bad dualisms are. I don't want to hold all that for the moment and just say that in creation, the animating principle is separation and distinction. The animating principle, what is giving life to creation, is a separating of one thing from another, at least at some level. So if you look at the 6 days of creation, and you'll see that it's divided into two groups of three, which is to say there's an intelligible hierarchy in it. But I thought this is pretty interesting, whether you buy it or not. So there are two groups of three, and I didn't know how to do columns on my slides, so you got the lines there. Bear with me, say a prayer. In day one, light, as I mentioned, without the sun. In day 4, the heavenly lights, including the sun. They're at the top of these two groupings. Day 2, heavens, separating space between the waters below and the waters above. Lyons is going to explain to us next Sunday what that means. But note that while God constantly says this was good at the end of the day, he doesn't say this is good about the creation of the heavens. He doesn't say that the heavens are good. But day 2 would line up with day 5, and the fish and the fowl were created in day 5. Day 3 then is earth, is separated out of the waters below, including plants and the makers of fruit. Well, earth corresponds with land animals, which are created on day 6, and plants would be man. particulars we'll talk about later, because plants offer the food that man needs to grow and evolve. But note, there's a little asterisk by man, because that's not declared to be good either. So as we go through these 6 days of creation, and we end the day, and God's really tired, and he looks out over his bourbon, and he says, this is really good. Except he doesn't say that about the heavens, and he doesn't say that about man. But what's interesting about this, if you separate them into separate groups, you'll see that first group, light, heaven, earth, plants, are basically fixed. There's a space created and something is there, but it's basically fixed. But in the second column, lights, fish, fowl, land animals, man, there's movement. There's freedom of action. And as you go down that list, you have more freedom. Do you see that? There's freedom of action, and the farther down that list you get, the more free you become. We can wander farther than fish or fowl or land animals and have greater freedom. Then God said, see, I've given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the air, and to everything that's on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food. So apparently we're supposed to be vegetarians. Actually, I read this passage as suggesting that we are needy and vulnerable. Needy and vulnerable, right? We are in constant need of water and food for our security and safety. We don't exist independently all by ourselves. Despite the distinctiveness and the separateness that's given rise to our creation, we are nevertheless dependent and vulnerable and in need. Then we say God created the human being in his image, and in the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. Here the question I think for us is, what does it mean to be created in the image of God? What does it mean to be created in the image of God? It doesn't mean that we are God. We're an image of God. But it means something. If we look back on the qualities of God in this chapter, we see God speaking and acting and judging and creating. If we are in the image of God, are we empowered, imbued with the same characteristics so that we can speak and judge and create? To speak, of course, is to make distinctions. That's what language does, right? Every time we utter a word, we are carving out something and saying, this is not that. Language is a vehicle for making distinctions, for separating one thing from another, right? If I say that chair is red, I'm saying it's not a bench and it's not blue. There's an inherent distinction in every word that we use. That's the power of language. So when God is making these distinctions and then judging it, hearing and understanding language, I think, is evidence of our bearing the image of God. When we say that God has created a world that's operating under principles that is discernible, that actually has a structure that we can figure out, we are saying that we are created in the image of God. There's something about the way our minds work and we understand things that can understand the world. We take that for granted, I think. But it doesn't have to be. And we're not as good at it as we think we are. Stephen Pinker, in a conversation I heard recently, said we've got to learn how to stay in conversation with each other. He's a scientist, as you know. Because pretty much everything we believe in science right now, in some period in the future, will be determined to be wrong. Which, of course, to read history is to verify, right? Newton was great until Einstein. Einstein's going to be great until somebody comes up with something else and decides that those little plugs he put into his equation are actually masking important things. right? We are learning more and more about the world, but there's no indication we can learn everything there is to know about the world, or that we even could. It's an assumption science makes that we can learn everything there is to know, but there's no scientific basis for that assumption. But the fact that we can understand anything at all, I think, speaks to our being made in the image of God. This is going to be important because I want to go back to something I said before. Other parts of creation are said by God to be good in the sense of being fit for the purpose for which they were created. You're not good because you're beautiful necessarily. You're not good because you're any of the other things that we might come up with. You're good because you're fit for the purpose for which you're made, right? So, creation, once human beings are present, is declared to be very good. Yet, humans, when they're created, are not declared to be good in and of themselves. What do you make of that?
No, I just think it's just kind of, God just didn't say good after everything. He didn't say it after heavens. He didn't say it after humans. But he did say it for overall. So
Yeah, you know, if I said, I know it's our anniversary, I meant to say I love you, but I forgot. I'm just saying. It seems to be part of the formula. But I hear you. I'm putting that in the overthinking category. Anybody else have a question over here?
Okay. I think that the reason why God didn't declare human beings good goes to your comment about us being in the image of God. I think if you look at the Bible, there's various aspects of God. God is vengeful. God can forgive and love, but can be quick to anger, right? And I think God may have understood that in creating human beings, in his own image, he created some of that duality of positive and negative attributes. And as a result, he couldn't say that it was good. He didn't necessarily say it was bad, but he knew what he created, and he knew that there was a duality to that.
Yeah, that's good. I like that.
but what do you make of the fact that he didn't say it after heavens?
I don't know. Let's stick with this question now, though. Yeah. I'm going to come back to that. It's a good question. Bill.
Yeah, I think I understand that we're dealing with two separate creation stories.
Just one. Just one.
Just one, but I mean, technically, scripturally, there are two stories. There's the one in chapter 1 plus 3 verses, and then
Right,
there's the one that
right.
starts there. And but I think if you read the second creation story back into what we're talking with here about the image of God, I think you have to understand why Adam and Eve are expelled from the garden, because they suddenly have the knowledge of good and evil. And that in some fashion challenges God. That's one thought I had. The other thought I had is, if you look at all of this as Hebrew scripture, written attempting to explain things that no one really understood, when God doesn't say humans are good, it may be because whoever was writing it, whenever they were writing it, knew the human history, knew failings of Israel, and knew that it was an up and down relationship with God. Sometimes it was good, sometimes it wasn't good. And so that, I think, may play into that a little bit. I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's good. I like that. I like that. Yeah, nice. Nice. So you said something really interesting. If you think of your child's picture, your natural born child's picture, and we say, oh, you look like mom, or you look like dad, or you look like that, that's a resemblance. But is that resemblance because there's something of you in them? You with me?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly part of it, but I think image in itself is a word that is a facsimile or something that looks like. I'm not saying it, and it's definitely not God-like capabilities. It's a human being, it's an animal on earth that he's given the higher intelligence to, and free will.
Okay, so you would draw a line between bearing an image and being part of. Okay, thank you.
I don't want to lose your train of thought with Martin's point.
Use the mic, I can't hear you.
I don't want to lose your train of thought with Martin's point. If you're
No, it'll take me months to figure out what Martin said.
What a great description of Martin.
Go ahead.
I took from your introduction to the question an inference, or you maybe didn't mean to it, but that cognition was the distinguishing similarity between man and God. And I accept that point, except it took the tree, as just referred to, as the place by which we were able to discern between good and evil. That prior to the apple and the serpent, what have you, we didn't have that awareness. Good and evil are subjective terms. They are points of view as it relates to our observation of an action. Man, in and of himself, contains the capacity to be good and evil. But I don't know that it would be proper for the author and for God to determine that man himself is by definition good or evil, the way these other creation items are. Goodness is God's assessment, not the thing itself. I believe this to be good. He's drawing a judgment. Mankind didn't necessarily have the ability to judge until it's developed its own awareness and capacity to compare.
Nice, nice. Anybody else? Yeah, here?
I was thinking about heaven and earth are one and two, so we come from two. We're made of two, the duality, and then everything else that's manifest is a fractality of God. So I don't really see us as just image. I see us as, in a sense, as God and man combined.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that, and what he said, I can resonate with. It's like everything that comes down to the higher consciousness is like, it could be inspiration, but then what we take from that, the principles of it all, and all of them are in pure form. So what Hitler did with his inspiration was one scenario. So that's the way I look at it. Like, what do we do with all the things that we have the capacity to be and be a part of? But it's because it's more than an image. I'm not quite sure how else to say that. It's like we really are God and we're not God. And it's how do we reconcile that?
Right. That's wonderful. Thank you. So does the row have another comment?
It may not be for the whole row. I cheated a little bit. Good is the translation of something into English. And I wanted to understand that because it's also to be beneficial. It's not good and evil, it's just beneficial to the creation of all things living. So is heaven good or bad? It was very distinct to say these things are beneficial to all life.
Right. Yeah, so I'm going to define good as fit for the purpose for which it was created. Fit for the purpose for which it was created, which is subjective, but maybe has some objective elements to it as well. But this is great. This is great. You're pushing at the edges of what I'm really asking about, because what I want to do is go back and do a third take on this story and a final take as we wrap up. We've got 5 more minutes at 11 o'clock. If you need to go get your kids from Godly Play, you will make my life enormously better if you do that. So, but I do want to try to get to the third take. The creation account has a moral intention. Whether a moral is subjective or objective, we can talk about another day. But it has a moral intention about good or bad. One of them is the incompleteness and ambiguity of human beings, which is, I think, resident in all of your comments, right? Whether it's historical take, we hadn't always been good. Whether it's an ontological take, we've got these good and bad in us, and we make a choice. All of you are recognizing, I think, that we're morally ambiguous beings. We just are. We're created that way. And the second would be the non-divinity and moral irrelevance of the entire visible cosmos, which is a point Randy was making earlier. Not just that we're diminishing these other gods, but that you cannot learn how to be in relationship with God, and you cannot learn how to be in relationship with other people from nature. Now, my guess is none of you believe that. Because I think we're in a world, at least I am, where nature feels like where God is obviously present, where I go to in order to get grounded, where I learn through the rhythms of nature how to lead a better life, which is why fly fishermen are better than everybody else. But I think Genesis is saying no to that, that you can only learn how to be in relationship with God from God. And you can only learn how to be in right relation with other people from God. You cannot go into nature and figure out how to love your neighbor. You won't find those ethical precepts on your camping trip. So I don't want to debate that because my guess is that's a bridge too far for many of you. It certainly was for me. But sit with it for a while because it's going to come up in how we interpret Genesis in these other stories. All right. We just kind of go back and summarize quickly. Heaven and its occupants are not eternal. They come into being, i.e., they're not gods. God is God. The other inhabitants of heaven are not. There's a special demotion of the sun, and nature cannot teach us how to live with each other. That's so frightening to me, I can't even pronounce it correctly. Nature cannot teach us how to love and live with each other. I want you to sit with that over the week. All right, so we don't have time to discuss this, but I've kind of offered it to you based on your understanding of science, whether it's evolution or Big Bang Theory. Do you think this story is consistent with science? Evolution is the most interesting topic to discuss because evolution assumes, there's not one thing called evolution, right? Evolution is just a category for a whole bunch of different kinds of theories, and people are still debating what Darwin actually meant. But for our purposes, things are changing over time, right, through evolutionary stages. Does this story account for that? Does it account for change and growth and evolution? And 2, does it suggest there's a purpose for creation? One thing consistent across most what's called scientific materialism, but also most evolutionary theories, is there is no purpose beyond survival. All the mutations and evolutionary stages are simply for the purpose of survival. We got a recent dose of that from the New Atheist, which wasn't all that long ago, right? When they just talked about memes and our attempts to camouflage our real sole exclusive purpose, and that is simply to survive. But do we as Christians think that's right? That our purpose here is just to survive? Or do we think God has given us a different purpose for being alive? Do we think God has given us a different purpose for being alive? You can bet your last dollar I'm going to be arguing from now to June we have a purpose to creation and try to show you how there's a way to look at evolution in order to see that purpose and live into that purpose in a way that we think about. I want to say finally that we've got the Sabbath And all I want to say about the Sabbath at this point is there's an assumption in the day of rest that creation is continuing. There's an assumption in the day of rest that God is still at work, that creation is continuing. That really what's happening on the Sabbath is not, I need to rest up, I'm tired, but I need to get my ego out of the way so God can be at work without me messing around with it. Do you see that? That's the real Sabbath. Can I stop trying to control this? Can I stop trying to make it different? Can I stop with my expectations and my judgment and my need to be the center of everything for a day? Most meditative prayers looking for the same kind of teaching. That, I think, is the real power of the Sabbath. So really what I'm claiming is out of this story, creation is full of these distinctions, but God creates a creation that continues to grow and change and align with its purpose, and that the high point of that creation are human beings who bear the image of God in the sense of being chip off the old block. The wording doesn't necessarily demand that interpretation, but that's my take. The patristic fathers had a saying that I like in this regard. It says, we were made in the image of God to grow into the likeness of God, which I think is kind of what you were saying, right? Made in the image of God, we had the ability to do this, to grow into the likeness of God. So we would become more godlike. And while it died off in the Western church, the Eastern church has always held on to an idea that's called theosis or divinization, which is that our purpose in life is to become Christ. It may not be possible until after our death, but Christ just wasn't this exemplary human moral teacher. Christ was what we can all become. The resurrection wasn't God intervening to show how powerful she is, but instead what Jesus is just the first of what is in store for all of us, which is new life. That our path as Christians and the reason we come to church is to pick the right incentives, to school our desires, that we may grow into being like Christ. Or, to quote Paul, that we may allow space for the Christ within us to continue to pray. Remember, Paul says, it's not me that prays any longer, it's the Christ within me that prays. Paul's theology includes this idea of us growing into the nature and likeness of Christ. That is our purpose. And I think that's why God didn't say that we're good, because we weren't yet. Right? If good is fit for the purpose for which we were created, we will be good when we have reached the end of this theosis. And the more we become like Christ, the better we are in terms of furthering the purposes that God has for creation. Right? The more we love, the more we become like Christ. It's not what did Jesus do as much as it is, it's not like, can I do what Jesus did? He was already God, for goodness sake. It's, can I be the way Jesus was, given my particular gifts, my particular place in life, the context in which I'm operating, can I be like Jesus in that context? Maybe I do what he did, but it's probably something different, because I'm different. But the purpose for my life is to be like Jesus as I'm in relationship with God and relationship with other people. I think Genesis contemplates this. All right, we will not be this abstract in the future. The purpose of this chapter, I think, in Genesis is to lay this cosmological foundation for these stories which are really earthy and full of human behavior. We're going to get it. We'll start with, as Bill said, the second creation story, Adam and Eve. And then, of course, we've got Abraham and Sarah and all these wonderful figures. So the purpose of the abstractness today is just to lay some foundations for how we're going to learn the lessons they have to teach us going forward. All right. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.